Fnirsi sent me this DPOS350P scope for review, and I was curious about how that works because on a scope with knobs it's pretty straightforward, but with a touchscreen there's all kinds of user interface stuff that you can do. Now last year they sent me their 1014D scope for review and I was very critical of that, but somehow they're okay with it. So let's have at it with this one. Now you can now hear the noise from my Rigol scope, and turning this one on, it's quite a bit louder, but it comes up in 3 seconds, which is really nice because this one takes 22 seconds, so that's definitely a plus for this one. And this one, which I actually use quite a lot, takes 13 seconds. And I use that one a lot because it doesn't have a cooling fan, because even the noise level for my Rigol is kind of annoying, so this one is pretty bad. And it's loud because it's got this teeny tiny little cooling fan in the back, and that has to move a fair bit of air because just using this as a scope, it draws about 12 watts off the power adapter while it's running, so that has to remove quite a bit of heat. This one draws about 17 watts off the power plug, and it's actually also got a cooling fan which is much bigger, and that fan is right here, and I taped this piece of felt on there to deflect the air backwards, and it actually absorbs quite a bit of the sound too, so that makes it less annoying that way. But it is possible to make quieter fans, so in this Geekom PC there is a centrifugal blower which blows through a heatsink out the back, and that'll easily take out 30 watts worth of heat with hardly any sound. Now on my tablet or my phone, I can zoom in and out just by pinching like that, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool if my scope could do the same thing? Now in this scope I can't zoom in doing a pinch like I can on the phone. In fact, it doesn't implement any multi-touch at all, but I can move the trace just by dragging it, which is quite nice. And to adjust the time base, I can tap on the left side or the right side of the screen, and to change the voltage I've got these buttons here, so that's actually not too bad. Multi-touch is really hard to implement, so I don't blame them for not doing that. And I'm afraid that screen is quite reflective, a bit more reflective than on my iPad, which hasn't been a problem but quite annoying when I'm filming. Now this scope can run off of battery. Right now it's plugged into this particular adapter right here. And that's a fairly beefy adapter. This one can put out 12 volts. In fact, this thing needs 12 volts. If the adapter can't give it 12 volts, it just kind of ignores it. And when it's charging the battery in there, it actually draws 20 watts from the adapter, so it does need a beefy adapter. And plugging that back into my power meter here. Now we're drawing a little bit more power on here, 13 watts, because it's not just running the scope, it's also charging the battery a little bit, because I just ran it down a tiny bit. And playing around with it a bit, the battery in this one lasts around 2 hours before it runs out, so definitely something you gotta charge after you've been using it. Now, running off of a power adapter like that, the scope has a floating ground, and just plugging a simple little wire in there like that, it actually picks up quite a bit of noise. This is at 100 millivolts per division, which isn't actually too bad compared to this one. It picks up a lot more, and that's at 500 millivolts per division. And just by grounding the scope, that cuts down on that noise quite a bit. And of course I can eliminate the adapter noise just by unplugging it, and then it's much cleaner. I don't have that same option here, but grounding this one also cuts down on the noise a lot. And this one's just always grounded through its AC connector, and that's been a problem at times too. And the screen on that one looks much crisper than the one on my Rigol screen, and that's because this one is 1024 pixels across versus 800 on this one. Same size screen, but that extra 20% resolution makes a big difference. One thing I really like about digital scopes is roll mode, where basically things just kind of scroll across, and if you find something interesting you can always stop and then zoom in on things to find it. This one also implements roll mode, but this one, the manual says it implements roll mode, but what they call roll mode is actually this, which I don't consider roll mode. And then if I were to catch some kind of a glitch, if I push stop right here, I only get a little wee bit of history, so kind of disappointing that way. And in combination with roll mode, it helps to have a really long trace buffer, so you can really zoom in and see what happened after the fact. This one has a 6 million trace buffer. This one's just 20,000 shared between the channels, so you run out of zoom capability very quickly. This one has a 60,000 trace buffer, which is much better, so I can zoom in and out quite a lot, but not quite as far as here. So here now I can actually see my individual samples. So that trace was captured at 25,000 samples per second, but if I reacquire now, It's getting at 25 million samples per second, and zooming in some more and reacquiring. I'm now at 1 gigasample per second, and we'll stop that. And I can zoom in some more, and again until I see individual samples. And we can see the trace going around corners, so that's the individual samples. And I've just put cursors on the corners of my trace, and that says 950 megahertz, so that's about right for 1 gigasample per second. But if I reacquire now and stop, that trace is all round, which is a bit funny. It still says 1 gigasamples per second, but now it interpolates, which I don't really like that much because it's kind of hiding where the actual samples are. Although my Rigol scope does the same thing, this is at 5 nanoseconds per division, and at 1 gigasample per second, I only have 5 samples here per division, which means those shouldn't look around like that, so it also interpolates sometimes. Now this scope has got a 16-bit A to D converter, whereas this one's only got an 8-bit A to D converter. So I've connected both of these scopes to this benchtop power supply, which can put out AC, and doing a single shot trigger on that. I've got the same trace on both of these, and you'll notice this trace is a little bit fuzzy, and that's at 5 volts per division, so let's magnify that a bit. 1 volt per division, and do the same thing here. And you can see this is much narrower than on here, and in fact you can see the quantization levels here already. Zoom in a bit more, and you can see basically these are the levels that the A to D converter can do, whereas on here, zooming in a bit more, so both of these are now at 200 millivolts per division, and we have the noise within 2 divisions on here, whereas here it spans about 4 divisions. So this one captures a lot cleaner, and I think that has much to do with this one being grounded to AC, and this also being powered off of AC. I may be introducing some noise that way, whereas this one is floating and it's actually running off the adapter still, so that's pretty good considering it's also on the adapter that introduces noise. And playing around with it in terms of capturing small signals cleanly, the Fnirsi definitely wins over the Rigol, especially if the Fnirsi is running off of its own battery. For this test, I've got 3 scopes just hooked up to a wire, which if I grab it, gives me a bit more signal, just receiving signal off the air. And this one is the cheapest one, and it samples that at 250 kilosamples per second because it has the shortest trace buffer. This one samples it at 1 megasample, longer trace buffer, and this one samples at 125 million samples because it's got a huge trace buffer. Now all 3 of those show that a little bit different. If I just grab that wire, we can see there's a lot of spikes shown on here, but not a lot of detail. This one shows a bit of fuzz in parts of the waveform, and this one puts much more emphasis on the fuzz, which makes it actually kind of hard to see the underlying waveform, whereas on this one the fuzz is less emphasized, so we still kind of see what the underlying waveform is underneath all that fuzz. The emphasis on the fuzz on here is kind of useful in that it gives you a sense of what's going on, but we see mostly the waveform is actually where it's supposed to be. So that emphasis on fuzz can actually be kind of annoying. That fuzz is mostly high frequency noise coming from this power adapter, so if I pull that out and run this off of battery, the fuzz for the most part disappears. So in terms of displaying the high frequency noise on there, I like how this one does it best because I can still see the underlying signal quite well. This one is hard to see, and this one just doesn't sample enough to give me a good sense of that. So I think this one wins in this regard. And in terms of noisy, uncertain signals, having played around with it quite a bit, I feel that the Fnirsi scope is one I can trust. The Rigol 2, although it puts too much emphasis on the noise, and the cheaper one, like the Hamantak scope, not so much. So if I've got an uncertain signal, I don't use that one. I use that one if I want to monitor a fairly well-known signal because it's quiet. If I've got to figure out what's going on, these 2 scopes are better. So overall, having played around with this, I find the touchscreen interface quite intuitive. You can just drag the cursors and the trace, and you end up fat finger clicking quite a lot. That happens a lot. Worst is if I accidentally hit the auto button while trying to do something else, because then I just lose everything. Now it's doing auto set. One thing that often gets me messed up is if I want to move the trigger level, I can't just drag that. It just doesn't work, so I have to push this button here, which gives me a slider for moving the trigger level. So that's gotten me messed up, especially if the trigger's up here, and again I try to hit the trigger here and I hit the auto set. But this gadget isn't just a scope, it also has a built-in function generator. It can work as a spectrum analyzer, and it can also plot frequency responses, which I think is really cool. So right now I've got a sine wave coming from the internal function generator plugged into itself, and if I change the frequency on here, that works nicely. And if I look on here, right now it says it's sampling at 50 megasamples per second, and the function generator goes up that high, so let's set that to 50 megahertz, and that should start aliasing to something much less. But it doesn't look like that at all. And playing around with this a bit, trying to figure out what frequency it does alias at, we'll go back into the function generator and reduce the frequency until we see more aliasing. Right around here, I think. So 47.487 megahertz aliases on here, where it says it's sampling at 50 megasamples per second. So that tells me that it's actually not sampling at 50 megasamples per second, but 47.487 megahertz. And just checking that frequency with my Rigol, it is indeed that frequency. So it's not that the function generator frequency is off, it's that the sampling rate is not what it claims to be. So that's at 50 megasamples per second. Let's zoom in so we're getting a gigasample per second, or at least it says that's what it is. We'll stop this and zoom in until we see individual samples, which is kind of hard to see with this waveform here. So again, just capturing signals off the air, and it says it's sampling at 1 gigasample per second. So we'll pause that, and then we'll zoom in until we see individual samples. So I've just placed two cursors to span 10 samples that I can see, and that calculates to a frequency of 95 megahertz, but of course it's actually 10 times higher because it's 10 samples. So instead of sampling a gigasample like it says, it's sampling actually at 950 megahertz or so. Now back to the function generator, it goes up to 50 megahertz, although for different types of waveforms it doesn't go quite as high, just for sine waves. And you can select all kinds of waveforms on here. And one cool thing about this one is you can also set a DC offset, which on a typical built-in function generator you can't do, so that's a very nice feature. Although the maximum output including DC offset is limited to about 3 volts, so it's a bit limited. Next cool feature of this thing is spectrum analyzer mode, and I'm just going to plug a piece of wire into here so I get some kind of input, and you'll notice there's quite a bit of stuff on the low frequency end, so let's zoom in on that a bit. We'll set the stop frequency to 200 megahertz, and we see quite a lot of stuff here. If I unplug it from the supply, that goes away because that power brick just adds an awful lot of noise to it. And now we also see a bunch of peaks here, and the scale on here is kind of useless, but if I put a cursor on it, put a cursor on either side of that group of things, and that is 89.6 megahertz to 99.9 megahertz. Well, if I go a bit further, there's a bit more. Now it's up to 110 megahertz. Basically, this here is the FM radio band. So let's set the start frequency to 88 megahertz and the stop frequency to 105 megahertz. And there's our FM band. Now, the peaks on here are not very sharp, and the silly thing is this thing uses FFTs, and by default it's 16K samples per FFT. Really, you should have more than 32K samples, but with a 60K trace buffer, it doesn't quite have 64K. So the maximum it allows here is 32K. Whoops. Turn the waterfall display off again. So there's some FM radio stations, but to get the frequency of these exactly, the problem is if the cursor is above 100 megahertz, it only gives me the frequency. There, this one is now at 101 megahertz, and I don't get any more detail on that. So it's pretty coarse that way. If it's below 100 megahertz, then it shows it to the nearest 100 kilohertz, which is still very coarse. And I don't have a whole lot of resolution on here either. So let's set the stop frequency to 99 megahertz, and we see some of these more, but again, they're not very well defined. So in frequency analyzer mode, it always samples at its maximum frequency, which is actually 950 megahertz, not a gigahertz. And with a 32K FFT window, that only gives me a frequency resolution of about 29 kilohertz. So not nearly as fine as a real spectrum analyzer would be. But still very cool that I can pick up FM radio stations straight off the air just with a piece of wire. Way better than I can do with FFT mode on my Rigol scope. And by default, when you set it in spectrum analyzer mode, it goes from 0 to 500 megahertz, which is a bit suspicious because its sampling rate is 950 megasamples per second. So a 500 megahertz sample would actually alias down to something else. So I wouldn't trust it in the high frequencies at all. And now I set it to 0 to 2 megahertz, which should span the AM band. And if I touch my antenna wire, I see there's a peak right here, which would correspond to an AM radio station. But I just don't get enough resolution because the AM channels are way closer together than FM channels. And with that 32K sample FFT and sampling at 950 megahertz, I just don't have the frequency resolution at the lower band to actually really see AM radio stations. That could have been addressed by just sampling at a lower rate for lower frequencies that I'm using here. And that could result in aliasing, but it does have bandwidth limiting filters that you can turn on, so that would work. So that is something they could have fixed in software, but they didn't. So this thing is no comparison to a real dedicated spectrum analyzer, and if you're looking for a cheap spectrum analyzer, some solution based on some software-defined radio would probably give you better results, but still, I think this is a pretty cool feature. Now, in my opinion, the coolest feature of this thing is frequency response mode, where it's using its built-in function generator to send out a sine wave and then probes what's coming out with one scope channel, and the other scope channel is used to probe what's coming out of my circuit. In this case, the circuit is just a straight wire with a 47 ohm load, and if I put one of these ferrite chokes on there, which is designed for suppressing electromagnetic interference, right now it's a fairly flat frequency response, but I put this thing on and clamp it shut, and now the frequency response drops off quite a bit. And I've put a cursor on here, and that is at 7.7 megahertz, and it's down about 3 dB there. So this thing is quite effective at suppressing frequencies above 10 megahertz or so. For my next test, I've got a capacitor and an inductor in parallel and fed in through a resistor, basically this schematic here, and that resonates at a certain frequency. And I'm plotting that from 500 hertz to 1 megahertz because at higher frequencies these inductors just kind of behave funny anyways. And I put cursor 2 on there, and that tells me it resonates at about 7.5 kilohertz. Now the orange here is the magnitude of what comes out, and the blue is the phase, and unfortunately it always auto scales the phase, which is not such a great idea. Should always make that like 360 degrees for the phase. And as the amplitude of what comes out is very low, it has a hard time detecting the phase accurately, which is why it jumps around so much and keeps rescaling it, which is kind of annoying. Now this inductor has got no core in there, but I can put some ferrites in there, and that will increase the amount of inductance that it has, which should drop the resonant frequency of the circuit. And now let's put cursor 1 on the new peak. Oh no! Fat finger! I don't know what happened now. I'm back in scope mode. Let's go back to frequency response mode. And fortunately it kept my settings here, so let's move that cursor. And the new resonant frequency appears to be 5.29 kilohertz. Now you'll notice that the scale here shows a log scale, and that's useful for indicating that it is indeed a log scale, except I'm going from 500 hertz to 1 megahertz. So this log scale is not exactly accurate. It always shows 3 decades no matter what the start and stop frequency is, and the only way to make that accurate is if I set the start frequency now to 1 kilohertz. Now I actually have my decades corresponding to factors of 10, but if we set the stop frequency, for instance, to 100 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz, whatever, it still shows 3 decades even though I've only got 1 decade on the scale. So I guess for a non-mathematical software developer, drawing a log scale from one arbitrary value to another arbitrary value is just too hard. But then I thought, well, let's see what AI can do. So I got Google Gemini AI to write this arbitrary log scale generator, and right now I've got 3 decades on here, but let's change the starting value to, say, something like 50. It has no problem doing that, and if I want the end value to 1 million, also no problem with that. So an arbitrary log scale is really not that hard to do. The only skill here is prompting the AI, and actually did tweak the code a little bit, but they could have done better. It's not that hard to do an arbitrary log scale. And if you're curious, here's the code. And I just wanted to see what it drives this with, so I hooked up my oscilloscope to that, and here's a trace from that. And looking at this and zooming in, we can see it goes through different waveforms here. And here it's driving 11.4 kilohertz. Look at the next one here. That's driving 13.5 kilohertz. And next one here, 22.7 kilohertz. So we can see it step through different frequencies. But what's weird is why such a long stop period in between, and why does it send out DC during the stop period? That doesn't make any sense. And then also looking at this, why is it driving some frequencies substantially longer than others? So this appears to be rather suboptimal. Unless they know something about how this works that I don't, but right now I consider that to be highly unlikely. But even so, this frequency response mode is really cool, really useful, and I really like playing around with it. But just like Spectrum Analyzer mode, I really wish they'd just finish writing the software. So overall, I have to say, I quite like this as a scope. I feel I can trust it as a scope, and the scope mode on it is really well done. Love the display, like the touchscreen, don't like the noise of it. It is really quite loud, so I'm just going to turn it off now so you don't get that noise. But in terms of being battery powered, I suppose you could say the fan is a feature because it means I never forget to turn it off, which means I don't run down the battery. I just turn it on, get my signal, and turn it off again, so I save battery capacity. And given that it turns on and is ready to use in 3 seconds, turning it on and off is not so bad. The function generator on this thing I'm also quite happy with, and the Spectrum Analyzer mode, really cool feature. I just wish it was just a little bit more refined. I wish they'd just done more work on the software. Same thing for the frequency response mode, which I think is a really cool feature. But again, I wish they'd just finished the software. But overall, as a scope, I think it's pretty good.